In this video, I'm going to talk about the different roles that organisms play within an ecosystem. So first, a few words of introductions. Remember that all organisms have the same basic needs for energy and for matter. They need energy for movement in cells, between cells, within the whole organism. And then matter, of course, are the atoms, the stuff that makes up everything that has volume, has a three-dimensional presence. Organisms are going to depend on their immediate environment, which is the ecosystem, what's around them, in order to meet those needs. Ecosystem itself is kind of a vague word because it can be very large or very small, but an ecosystem contains all the biotic or living and abiotic or non-living factors that are going to impact on the organisms in that area. And there's a lot of interdependence and relationship between all those factors. So when we use the word role, we talk about the role that an organism plays in an ecosystem. We're talking about how really it obtains its energy, because energy, remember, is on a one-way path through the universe, coming in from the sun, our major source of energy, and passing from organism to organism. But when we look at energy, what we're really thinking about is how does that organism get its food? What does it eat? Because we eat food in order to get energy. We also eat food in order to get matter, but we're going to focus on energy because it does have that one-way flow, whereas matter is cycling and recycling over and over again through those different nutrient cycles that we've talked about, like the carbon cycle or the nitrogen cycle. So the first level of organism role that we're going to talk about are producers. And producers, we've already mentioned, they are also called autotrophs. Producers are organisms that can produce their own food, often through photosynthesis. There's a small category that use chemosynthesis, but we focused on photosynthesis. Now, there is not one type of producer that works in all ecosystems. We have different types of producers found all over the earth in the biosphere because of the different characteristics of the ecosystem. And in any ecosystem, though, producers are the foundation organism. They are the organism that brings the energy into the ecosystem. So if you don't have producers, you're not going to be able to sustain life in that ecosystem. Just looking at this chart, we've got three broad categories of producers that we find on Earth. In the terrestrial or on land, we typically are thinking about plants as being our producers, both small plants and large plants. In aquatic systems, whether that's freshwater or saltwater, also called marine ecosystems, the producer that we're concentrating on is algae. Sometimes you do have some freshwater plants that are producers as well, but algae are the primary producers if you're looking at the aquatic systems as a whole. They are not plants, they are their own type of organism, and though some of them, like the seaweed, can look like a plant in appearance. And then throughout the biosphere, all over the earth, on land, on water, we have bacteria. Bacteria are very important as a producer because even though we tend to think about life on Earth as being something big that we can see, something macroscopic, there really is a tremendous amount of organisms that are microscopic, and so they would need microscopic producers of food in order to get their energy. So we're starting our ecosystem with the energy coming in and being captured by producers, and then it can move on to other organisms. So the next main category are consumers, and these are heterotrophs, as we've talked about earlier, but consumers have to eat other organisms for food. They are not able to make their own food. And there are a number of categories of consumers, and you've heard about this, I know, in earlier science classes. We're just going to take that to a little more sophisticated level as we move on in this unit. So the familiar types of consumers that we find in ecosystems consist of herbivores, which are consumers that only eat producers. They only consume producers. So we sometimes can just think about colloquially as something that only eats plants. So we have our panda over here that's dining on bamboo shoots. It is an herbivore. So herbivores are not just cows and deer and things like that, but also some of our other animals. In the aquatic systems, sea urchins are herbivores, and they can decimate seaweed forest in the offshore area if there's too many sea urchins. So after herbivores that only consume producers, we have carnivores, which only consume other consumers. So they only eat animals, or they're meat eaters. But again, we've got to think in our ecosystem beyond sort of the elementary level of, a lion catching a gazelle in the African savanna, and think about a praying mantis catching another insect as being an example of a carnivore, a consumer that eats other consumers, does not eat herbivores, could not live just on plants, but needs those producers in the ecosystem to feed the things that they are going to eat. The next category are omnivores, which are consumers that eat both producers and consumers. So they're getting both plants and animals in their diet. They can grab their energy from either thing. People, of course, fall into this category, but so do other familiar animals. Pigs, for example, are omnivores. They'll pretty much eat anything. Chickens are pretty good at being omnivores too, though they can't live well just on plants. Then finally, we have a type of consumer that doesn't eat doesn't get their dinner live, but they are scavengers. They are looking around for things that are already dead. Previously, or already dead animals sometimes are known as carrion, so these can be known as carrion feeders. And so they are eating what's already been killed, help clean up the ecosystem. For one thing, we really need those scavengers. And they, again, are carnivores, but they're not carnivores that are chasing down their prey and eating it. They're finding it already dead and kind of cleaning up that decaying mess. And then we have another type of consumer known as a parasite. Typically, people don't think of this one as being a consumer, but they are going to inhabit a host animal and then take the food from it. So they're going to steal the energy and the nutrition that's coming into that animal and grab it for itself. Something like a tapeworm that lives inside a digestive system and takes those nutrients as they pass by is an example of a parasite. Then our last major role for organisms in the ecosystem are decomposers, which is another type of heterotroph because they're needing to depend on something else for their food. They can't produce it themselves. So decomposers eat dead and decaying remains of other organisms, whether it is plant or animal, to get their food, to get their energy, to get their matter. And they are extremely important for returning the nutrients to the ecosystem. Decomposers are essential for the nutrient cycles to get carbon, to get nitrogen, to get phosphorus back in the ecosystem. They include things such as the invertebrates of worms and insects that you will sometimes see on decaying plant matter or decaying animals out in the world, fungi, of course, and bacteria. So this chart is just showing an example of how this energy can be passed along from one organism to another in an ecosystem. This is an aquatic or a marine ecosystem. So down on the bottom we have our various types of producers. We have some algae of different types mentioned here. These are diatoms, another type of very small single-celled organism that are found in marine environments, some other types of single-cell protists that we have here. So these are all the creatures that are providing the foundation food because they are able to capture the energy from the sun and put it into molecules that then can be used by the other organisms in that ecosystem. So the second level moving up are the herbivores, the things that would eat those producers directly. So many of these are probably familiar or not familiar to you, but you might be aware of mussels or mollusks, things in shells. We've got some very, very small organisms. We have a water flea over here, which is a little invertebrate with a, looking somewhat like a flea on land, but present in the water. Then if we follow the arrows up to the next level, we are finding organisms that will be consuming those herbivores. So our second level is getting into some of your carnivores. So we've got an eel here, and you can follow the arrows. It's going to be eating everything on the level below it, or a yellow perch, some fish that might be familiar to some of you. If you look at the arrows underneath the shrimp, you'll see we both have a green arrow coming directly from the producer and then one coming from this first level of consumers. And so the shrimp would be an example of an omnivore. It will consume both producers and consumers. Then we have on the very top level, we've got another level of consumers. So these are ones that are going to eat kind of the small, the big fish that eat these smaller fish. We got some salmon and trout, again, words that you probably are familiar with. And over here on the end, we have a lamprey, which is a parasite. You can see this is their mouth, lots and lots of teeth to hook on to the fish and use it as a source of food, often before it is dead, so it's going after live prey. So these are just some examples of how some of the organisms that are present, the roles that they're playing in their ecosystem, in an aquatic or marine ecosystem. And finally, I just want to stress that as you move through these different levels, so we start with producers, and they grab 100% of the energy that they can from the sunlight. They don't get every bit of energy from sunlight. Only a small amount of the sunlight that lands on a plant is actually going to be captured in the chlorophyll molecule and used for photosynthesis. But all of the energy that they put into, or they're able to produce from doing the photosynthesis, when that is consumed by the first level, the herbivores, so here we have insect larvae as an example, really only 10% of that energy is available to be used by that insect, because a lot of that energy has to go into building this plant and keeping that plant alive. And so as you move from one level in these different organism roles, there's actually less energy available to keep that organism alive, which is why you have lots and lots of plants and probably a fair amount of insects. But when you get to the top of an ecosystem, the consumers that are sort of your top predators, comparatively speaking, there's not going to be very many of them in the ecosystem because there's not very much energy available at that level to sustain them. So in this example, the insect larvae would be eaten by bonobo chimpanzees, and then those could provide some dinner for a crocodile. And so as you move into the higher levels of consumers, the consumers that are eating other consumers, you're not going to be able to draw enough energy out of them without having just a few of those top predators in any particular ecosystem. This finishes the overview of organism roles. I just wanted to focus on these different roles before we start putting them together into food webs.